Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. Thank you everyone who's joining here on Zoom and those who are joining on YouTube. We'd like to start the program with recitation of Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لم تقولون ما لا تفعلون كبر مقتا عند الله أن تقولوا ما لا تفعلون إن الله يحب الذين يقاتلون في سبيله صفا كأنهم بنيان مرصوص. وإذ قال موسى لقومه يا قوم لم تؤذونني وقد تعلمون أني رسول الله إليكم فلما زاغوا أزاغ الله قلوبهم والله لا يهدي القوم الفاسقين. وإذ قال عيسى ابن مريم يا بني إسرائيل إني رسول الله إليكم مصدقا لما بين يدي من التوراة ومبشرا برسول يأتي من بعده اسمه أحمد. فلما جاءهم بالبينات قالوا هذا سحر مبين. ومن أظلم ممن افترى على الله الكذب وهو يدعى إلى الإسلام والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. يريدون ليطفئوا نور الله بأفواههم والله متم نوره ولو كره الكافرون. هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا هل أدلكم على تجارة تنجيكم من عذاب أليم. تؤمنون بالله ورسوله وتجاهدون في سبيل الله بأموالكم وأنفسكم ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. يغفر لكم ذنوبكم ويدخلكم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار ومساكن طيبة في جنات عدن ذلك الفوز العظيم. وأخرى تحبونها نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا أنصار الله كما قال عيسى ابن مريم للحواريين من أنصاري إلى الله قال الحواريون نحن أنصار الله. فآمنت طائفة من بني إسرائيل وكفرت طائفة فأيدنا الذين آمنوا على عدوهم فأصبحوا ظاهرين. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. We are now very fortunate to have Dr. Ursula Bsees, who will be speaking to us about, on the title, Looking Over the Early Muhaddith's Shoulder, a study of hadith production and transmission based on original documentary sources. Dr. Bsees got a PhD in 2015 from the University of Vienna and is a researcher specialized in Arabic Papyrology, especially literary texts, Islamic manuscripts, and Islamic Popular Religion. Her current project examines scholarly culture, the transmission of knowledge, and the intellectual landscape in early Islamic Egypt. She teaches and does research at the Institute for Near and Middle Eastern Studies at LMU Munich, Germany, where she also manages a project on the typology of Arabic documents. We're very much looking forward to the talk today. And if you do have any questions on YouTube, please do message them on the chat function there or directly to me or one of the executive committee members. And if you're on Zoom, please feel free to put your hand up later on or ask your questions on the chat. So without further ado, Dr. Bsees, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. Thanks everyone for attending. Let's jump right into it. I will share my screen. So what I will be speaking about today is basically the result of my research over the last 3 years. So I will present some of the most important results of my research, some of the most important things that I have found out. So I basically have been looking at hadith production in the very earliest sources from Islamic history. What sources I will still mention more specifically. I've looked at how scholars worked, how texts were passed on, and also at what we can actually find in those texts. And I will walk you through a couple of results and a couple of things that I've discovered. So in order to set the time frame that we are working with, that I was working with, and I'm working on early Islamic history. So my time frame basically starts at 642 CE with the Arab conquest of Egypt. And so it ends more or less in 969 CE, which is the date of the Fatimid conquest of Egypt. It's just to set the time frame, more or less, that we will be dealing with. So that basically means the first 3 Islamic centuries. Why this time frame? This time frame is not arbitrarily set, but it is the time frame that Arabic and Islamic history and literature was written in its, let's say, in its very earliest attestations. It is also the time where certain text corpora get consolidated or form. I have put the most important and the most relevant to my work on this slide. So Quran and Hadith get consolidated and formed in the shape that we know it nowadays, more or less during the first 3 Islamic centuries. We have the completion of a standardized version of the Sunni Quran. We have the canonization of the Hadith, prophetic tradition, as you are certainly all aware, and of Islamic law. So the 4 legal schools of Islam get established. Arabic literature gets basically appears, especially prose. So of course, Arabic poetry is much older than Islam. Its tradition goes very far back, but especially prose in Arabic occurs first during the first 3 Islamic centuries. Arabic translations of the Bible are being made. Arabic translations of the Greek sciences are being made. So Greek philosophy meets Islam. And it is also the time where speculative theology in Arabic, Ilm al-Kalam and Islamic philosophy first appear on stage, if you will. That is one of the reasons why this time is very important as a consolidation phase of many things that we nowadays consider typically Islamic. Many corpora of literature, many schools of thinking or ideologies that we consider typically or traditionally Islamic form and get consolidated during this time. It is also at that time that the Arabic language is used on papyrus. The earliest witnesses that we have for Arabic texts that go beyond inscriptions, coins, and very early sheets of Quran are on Arabic papyri. So the earliest surviving texts from Islamic history, apart from inscriptions, coins, and the occasional Quran leaf, are on Arabic papyri. Papyrus is an Egyptian writing material. That means that sets the beginning of our time frame, because with the Islamic conquest of Egypt, the Arabic language starts to get written on this Egyptian writing material, which is papyrus. Papyrus is made out of the strips of the stems, actually, of the cut up stems of the papyrus plant. This plant can only grow in Egypt due to climatic reasons, though there were attempts at growing it elsewhere, but none highly successful. It's a typically Egyptian writing material, and it is basically produced by laying strips of the material over each other in, like a, if you will, a checkerboard way, like, and then they basically get pressed and dried, and they can also be, like, the surface can still be softened with different materials, but I'm not going to go into that. There are, of course, many sources also online available as to the production of papyrus. So it is a distinctly Egyptian writing material. That means all Arabic and Islamic writings from the first 3 Islamic centuries that have survived, apart from the kinds of documents that I already mentioned, but those documents that have a bit larger mass of text that have survived from the early Islamic time are written on papyrus and come from Egypt. Papyrus was used for writing in early Islamic Egypt from 642 CE, which is when Egypt was conquered by the Arabs or the Muslims. Like, at that time it was still the same. So from 642 CE until the introduction of paper to Egypt. This is, of course, the end of papyrus, because paper is much easier to produce and to use, so this transition happened sometime during the 10th century CE, which is the 4th century of the Hijri era. Arabic papyri, as we have them nowadays, can be found in collections and institutions worldwide. In the UK, for example, in the British Library in London, many UK universities have papyrus collections. The University Library of Cambridge, Trinity College in Cambridge, the Bodleian Library in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the Rylands Library in Manchester, and so on. But there are collections worldwide, institutions, lab libraries or universities or other institutions of research that do have papyri, and especially Arabic papyri with Arabic language. Arabic papyri also mainly come from trash heaps. So they were practically all thrown out at some point. So it is used material. We have practically no archives with Arabic papyri, which for example set Arabic papyri apart from Greek papyri. So papyri in Greek language have been found in archival contexts, very contrary to Arabic papyri. The biggest collection of Arabic papyri is in the Austrian National Library in Vienna. It's a historical coincidence. If you really need to know why, I can answer that during the Q&A. They have about 20,000 single pieces of Arabic papyrus. The earliest dated papyrus, so that means bearing a date, a clearly visible date, so the earliest dated papyrus, and also by that, the earliest dated document from Islamic history is an Arabic papyrus from the year 22 Hijri. It is not a hadith, it is not a Quran, it is actually a request for provision for the military. It is a very profane, if you will, document where actually it is a bilingual Greek and Arabic document where sheep and bread are requested as provision for the military, if you want to, if you're interested in that. About 4% only of Arabic papyri have been published. So there has been research about on about 4% of the material only. And of that material, 95% are documentary. Documentary means all texts that would also nowadays be considered a document. A letter, a tax receipt, some legal document like a contract. Those are documentary papyri. 95% of what has been published, of what has been researched, are documentary papyri, and only 5% of what has been published are literary papyri. Literary papyri means Quranic leaves, hadith, magic, other literary treatises, biographies, historical works that do exist actually on papyrus, but there has been very little interest in them. And it's also rather hard to work with literary papyri. I can also tell you why in the Q&A if you're interested in that. We always need new researchers, so if anyone is interested in learning them, you're very welcome. Papyri in general are documentary texts. What does that mean? They are direct sources, direct witnesses for their time. They are not historiography. Of course, they are not books of history. They are direct sources from their time. So we are, if we are looking at hadith papyri, indeed looking over the early hadith scholars' shoulder. We are not seeing a historian writing about the time when papyrus was in use. No, we see basically what that hadith scholar wrote in the second Islamic century. So this is the first advantage, or these are more or less the first two advantages of those texts that of working with those texts that I've written here on this slide. They are direct witnesses of their time, which means we have no idealization, like we would find it in historical literature that speaks about past times. Everything used to be better before, And so the same can happen in historiography, in historical literature. So when scholars that write a couple of centuries after the time look back onto the time where papyrus was in use, when hadith was produced on papyrus, they might idealize that time, or they might add normative elements, which means they add elements that speak about how things should be. And the idea of how things should be is projected into earlier times, or some other distortions. So documentary texts that all papyri belong to, and that also the hadith papyri belong to, actually cannot bear these distortions, as they are just direct texts, like direct witnesses of their times. The downsides are, however, that archaeological context and precise provenance are often unclear, because nowadays we find those papyri in collections and institutions worldwide, but it is very much there is very lots of confusion about how they were acquired sometimes, by whom and through whom. So they were often bought from local traders that not necessarily themselves had accurate information about where these papyri were exactly found. The second downside is that since those texts come as direct witnesses from historical times, the interpretation and establishing the historical context that they come from is up to us. Those are just direct witnesses. They are direct, that texts that were written more or less 1,200 or more years ago, but they don't come with a manual. They don't tell us what was happening around. socially, historically, politically. We have to get that from historical literature and just put the bits and pieces together. So let's start by looking at some of the material. So I'm showing you these two papyri in order to make a point about how little work has been done on them. These are two papyrus texts. The one on the left-hand side is kept at the University of Michigan Library. The text on the right-hand side is kept at the University Library in Cambridge. The text on the left-hand side was published at the end of the 60s in Nabia Abbott's groundbreaking work, Studies in Arabic Literary Papyri, that until today remains the only more or less systematic work on literary papyri, on Arabic literary papyri. It was published, but the text on the right-hand side was only published last year by a colleague from Turkey, by a Turkish hadith scholar who actually does not come from the papyrological side, but he comes from the hadith studies side. And so it was only published last year. And he also did not really go into detail as how these texts really belong together. But ultimately, as can be told from the handwriting and also from the content, they belonged to the same scholarly notebook. Let's move on. Let's look at this papyrus. So what I can illustrate with this piece are two things, basically. Also, the first point is how little work has been done on these texts during the last, basically, 100 years that scholars have been active in Arabic papyrology. Because as you can see, hopefully, depending on your screens, there is a very small gap, or that there is like a separation line between the upper 2/3 and the lower third of this document. And you can also see that it has two shelf marks, two inventory numbers combined. This is because the part that forms the two upper thirds and, on the other hand, the lower part were kept in Vienna. It's a Vienna piece, were kept under two different inventory numbers. And it was only about 3 years ago that I systematically went through the collection and noticed that these actually belong together. And with the help of the local personnel, the local staff at the library, I was able to put these two documents together to what they originally were, in all likelihood, as can be told from the text and also from the material. This piece is also very nice because it exhibits a very peculiar way of handwriting, actually. So for those of you who are into Arabic a bit, this is of course Arabic. It's a very nice hand, and it's definitely not a hand as we encounter it very often. But what I also want to show you is that one of the things that can be difficult when working with papyri is that many are fragmentary. So the material is quite old, of course. It's from the first Islamic centuries. This one maybe second Islamic century. I will speak about dating these texts in a couple of minutes. What we can see is that it's fragmentary. The material is very fragile. It has only survived in Egypt in areas that are very dry, in areas that are now desert, because papyrus as an organic material deteriorates in humid environments. That is also why, of course, those are always kept in special conditions at the collections where they are nowadays, because especially humidity is very bad for papyri. What I will show you now is my English translation of what you can see on the right-hand side here. So the picture that you can see now on the right-hand side, I will show you my English translation of at least its most important parts. So the parts where a lot of the lines are missing or where it's torn, basically, I will not show you my couple of words that I could guess from those missing lines. I will just show you like what's there, basically. That's just a very short example of what we actually find here. So of course, it is a hadith papyrus. This is what I'm mainly working on. I'm working on hadith, on in Arabic papyri, hadith on papyrus. So in this papyrus, on both sides combined, we find hadith from Kitab al-Yaqeen by Ibn Abi Dunya, and we find hadith from Nu'aym ibn Hamad's Kitab al-Zuhd. If you know it, good. If you don't know it, now you know. Yeah, now you do. So I will read. So basically, I'm starting in line 3. So it was transmitted, or I was told by Ubaidullah ibn Abi Ja'far that a man was afflicted with illness and it kept him from eating and sleeping. One night, when he was awake, he heard the sound of something falling in his room. Then he heard words. He understood it and spoke it and recovered immediately. O God, O Allah, if you will, I worship you and unto you I pray. So put the cure in my body and conviction in my heart, light in my eyesight, thankfulness in my breast, and your remembrance by night and by day on my tongue, as long as you let me live and provide me with sustenance, neither forbidden nor prohibited. And the line still goes on for a bit. Then on line 9 we read, and he reported to me from, then a bit is missing, like from so-and-so, from so-and-so. You know how hadith works, right? You have this chain of transmission. So-and-so reported from so-and-so, from so-and-so, and at the end from the messenger of God, may God bless him and grant him peace. He said or said, indeed, all hearts are aware, and some are more aware than others. So supplicate to God, O people, when you supplicate, convinced that you will be heard, because God does not answer a servant calling unto him with an inattentive heart. So this is my English translation of that bit. So what we have seen is actually one of the most frequent topics in Hadith papyri. But the very most frequent topic in all Hadith papyri that I have seen, and I have done a systematic study of about 150 papyri, a bit more. So I think I have more or less gained an overview. The most frequent topic of all that occurs in all hadith is prayer, salat. But there is really a very wide range of topic also among salat. So we have papyri that have hadith on very technical questions of prayer, like behavior in a mosque, prayer while traveling, like also how long when I'm traveling can I pray the short prayer. You know that you can pray if you go further than a certain distance from your usual residence. But it also goes up to moral admonitions against bragging about praying. You know, that someone like really brags that they pray regularly. So it's really this whole range. Like it goes from, as I said, very technical aspects of how to do it correctly. Also ablution, wudu. You know, has some things about ablution also occur. And it goes on until moral considerations and moral implications of prayer and anything that's connected to it, basically. So we have a wide range also of sub-topics and sub-aspects of prayer in those many accounts. So the second most frequent topic, admonitions. Oh yes, I might have. There's a typo. So I hope it will not. I hope it's not too bad for everyone. The second most frequent topic in Hadith papyri, that like inside the text of the Hadith, is actually dua, supplication. Mostly recommendations about what to say during dua, like what's a good thing to say, as we have actually just seen in the papyrus that I showed. It was like in the papyrus that I showed, it was more or less put into a story of that man who got ill and then had some kind of vision or some kind of this occurrence where he heard actually a voice suggesting what he should say to be in order to be cured. And this is, of course, a recommendation for the reader, also, or for the listener, what to say, what dua to say for shiha, for cured of to be cured of an illness, of a disease. Then there is a lot of instructive or edifying hadith, what I have called that. So that would also overlap with this story about this ill man, basically. So what I mean by instructive or edifying hadith is that hadith that is not so technical, that is not just, how should I say, that just doesn't just tell you the Prophet said this and that, like in a very short sentence, but that is maybe like wrapped into a story, like what we just had, that somehow tells you what to do, but also in an edifying way. So that is not so technical. Actually, the presentation is also not so technical, or also, as we just saw, about the attentive and inattentive hearts. Then social or moral matters, like there is, for example, this very famous hadith about the signs of a hypocrite. So there are 3 signs of a hypocrite, and so on. So this I would frame as, or like I would name like social or moral matters. Then there are legal issues. So there's a papyrus that talks about the legal consequences of breastfeeding. So you know that breastfeeding establishes kinship actually in Islamic law. So we do have that also on papyrus. Then also very importantly, we have pious tendencies and also counter arguments against exaggerated piety. I'll still talk about that in a couple of minutes actually. So then I mentioned collections. What do I mean by that? So where and how can we identify our hadith texts in the papyri? Of course, if they occur in known works of hadith, if they also occur in known works of hadith. So some accounts do appear in the 2 Sahihs, Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, or in the 6 books of canonical hadith, but actually many hadith accounts on papyrus occur in non-canonical works. For example, Musnad Abi Ya'la, Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, or also what I mentioned before, the Zuhd by Nu'aym ibn Hammad, or the Kitab al-Yaqeen by Ibn Abi Dunya. And that is, of course, in my opinion, not a coincidence, because those pious tendencies that I will still speak about were quite present actually in the Egyptian scholarly milieu, as I suppose. Most hadith on papyrus is datable by isnad to the late 2nd Hijri and 8th CE century. So, as you know, hadith has this chain of transmitters. That means the transmitter that is historically latest is the last, like this hadith must have been transmitted after that guy was born or well attained maturity, of course, and did his scholarly work. So if you take the latest transmitter and more or less like his lifetime, because there is no one after him, right? So then this must be actually also the time that this hadith has been written down. It must have been written down in his generation. And so those papyri that do have the full isnad preserved and that also have the last transmitter preserved, given the often fragmentary status of the papyrus that I have talked about before. So most papyri that have this last transmitter in the isnad, in the chain of transmitters preserved, can by that be dated to the late 2nd Hijri century. Isnad treatment differs though. So I would suggest that is according to text purpose or intended audience. That means it depends on what the text was written for. It has been suggested in scholarly research before, not by me, already by others before me, that most of the hadith on papyrus comes from scholarly notebooks, as opposed to finished, complete, authored works that represent one continuous effort of writing a book. So the difference here, as very succinctly put by Gregor Schöler, if you are into the scholarly literature on the topic, the difference here is actually between writing and publishing. So also, as far as I can tell from my own research, most of the hadith papyri come from scholarly notebooks. So they are the daily texts, the texts that scholars were producing for their own work as written, like support for memory or text collections that they would use for teaching or for other purposes, but they were not finished, publishable, if you will, books that were authored by one person in one effort. Those books probably did exist, but they had, as I would say, a very different life cycle. Can actually talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested, but in the main part of my talk, I actually don't have time for that. But what I want to say is that ISNAD treatment, how the chains of transmitters were treated, how elaborate they are, if they are there at all, and how their relation to the main text, the matan of the hadith is, in my opinion, depends, in my opinion, on what the text was meant for. Like, did this scholar write down the text because he wanted to teach to his students who were also muhaddithin, the very technical aspects of hadith? Then he would have to be very precise on that, and he would also have to be very precise on the text. Like, he would only really transmit the very essence of what the Prophet or whoever, or one of the Sahabis or one of the Prophet's family would have said, like only the bare content of the hadith. But if it's an audience who is maybe not made up of scholars, if it's for a khutbah, then he would, of course, put this hadith in very different words, and very technical questions of isnad realization would not come into play as much. Let's now, if I can, look at a very interesting collection. And I know actually might come to an end soon, but anyway, let's look at this. So from what I've just said, that most hadith papyri were scholarly handbooks, we actually do have also even closer evidence for that. I have called this a scholar's handbook on papyrus. There is one document in the Vienna collection in the Austrian National Library. That is why it has this shelf mark, P. Wind Impf. This always says that it is preserved in Vienna. And so it has A and B because it's two leaves of what was originally at least 3 leaves. So there are leaves that were folded in the middle for a collection of texts that was written down on them. It has Psalm 1 to 13 of Kitab al-Zabur, which means the Islamic Psalms of Prophet David. It has accounts of Muhammad's death and Judgment Day. It has hadith style accounts. Hadith style, I mean with a very short isnad, of Fatima's death and probably also Hussein's death, but it's the problem is that this part is actually very badly damaged, so I don't want to be too concrete on that. And the accounts of Fatima's death include also poetry spoken by Ali. Then it has a lot of text that would fall into the ideological framework of zuhd, which means can be translated as asceticism or renunciation, and wara, piety. It exhibits a pietistic worldview oriented towards the hereafter, including fear of punishment on Judgment Day, like exaggerated fear of punishment on Judgment Day, repentance and weeping over sin, which is also expressed in recurring recommendations for prayer, for right guidance and forgiveness. Of course, Kitab al-Zabur is regarded as a text that stands very much in this pietistic, ascetic tradition. It also has another text that is called Munajat Dawood li Rabbihi, so the intimate conversation, the intimate prayer of Prophet David towards his Lord, or with his Lord. What all these texts have in common is not only that they are very much oriented towards the hereafter, as I said, they exhibit a lot of fear of punishment on Judgment Day. Also descriptions of paradise are very frequent. But what they really, really all have in common concerning their overall nature is that they have a very oral and exhortatory character. They have very rhetoric character. Most of actually all of the texts are in dialogue, which leads me and also the second scholar who is working on this with me, David Vishnoff from the University of Oklahoma in the US, which leads us to think that this text collection was actually used as a base for khutbah, for sermons, because it has this oral or rhetoric, exhortatory character, and also that also speaks about very emotional topics, fear of judgment, weeping, death, loss. So this is actually what leads us to think that it is also a very nice exemplar of a literary papyrus. It is very interesting also to see how the scholar has treated this papyrus. As you can see, the text has been, the papyrus has been folded in the middle, more or less in the middle. There's a bit missing of the left page actually, so it would have been in the middle. Of course, just the fact that it has been folded in the middle and that it actually has holes in the middle, that I hope you can see, suggests that there were, of course, much more than those two leaves sewn together in the middle. So they had to be kept together somehow, which of course suggests that there were more than just this leaf and the other one that still also belongs to the same shelf mark now. It is also interesting to see, if you can see, otherwise please believe me, that on the left, on what is the left-hand side here, some of the text is upside down, which leads me to believe that actually the scholar who composed this notebook, so that actually means two things. It means that the scholar started to write on one side and also turned his page. And that, of course, in turn means that this is not a finished publishable copy of one continuous text, because this is not how a beautiful copy of whatever work would look like, right? So this is really these are his private notes. This is his private text collection that, in all likelihood, since it almost completely lacks isnad on the one hand, and also has, as I have already said several times, has this exhortatory, rhetoric, a dialogue character. It was very, very probably not meant for his peers, his colleagues in hadith scholarship, or in as preachers or whatever his main occupations were. Of course, at that time, also there was no clear cut between imams, hadith scholars, Quran scholars. So it was really like Islamic scholarship was still actually in a stage where there was no differentiation between scholars active in different Islamic sciences. Actually, those Islamic sciences were still being established as separate disciplines at that time, basically, right? So whatever Islamic occupations this scholar had, he most definitely, or as it can be quite probably assumed, prepared this text collection, this pietistic text collection, for sermons, for khutbahs. It is also interesting to note here that this text probably comes from the 8th, 9th, or 9th, so 2nd or early 3rd century of the Hijri era, from an area, that's actually what I wanted to say, that is a bit peripheral at that time in the Islamic world, because this comes from Egypt. And this pietistic renunciation movement, whose ideas feature greatly in this text, actually already started to subside and be replaced by Sufism in the East, which, like Iraq, more or less, Iraq and the Fertile Crescent, where the center of the Islamic world was at that time. So at the time that actually this movement and this kind of school of thinking, if you will, actually started to subside and be replaced by Sufism, we still have very clear evidence that scholars in Egypt were still very much into these ideas and this current. And it's not only this text, but pious ideas and prominent figures of Islamic piety and renunciation, especially the prophets Jesus and David, also occur very often in other hadith papyri. So it is quite clear that those were ideas that were present, not only in the more technical hadith papyri, but also in this collection for probably a lecture or many lectures in front of a non-strictly scholarly audience, like the one that I gave today. So thank you everyone very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your talk and your questions. Sorry, and the presentation. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to put your hand up on the Zoom, or if you're on YouTube, feel free to send a message through the chat there. But let's start with the first question. When it comes to looking at papyrus, do you think that gives greater reliability on the actual hadith itself, or do you think that, or is reliability need to be looked at separately, and the collections in books at a later stage are equally as reliable?
So that is definitely a quite difficult question, because it depends, of course, where you come from a scholarly point of view. I myself am not dealing with the question of authenticity and reliability as concerning the content and the consequence that it has for Islamic the practice of Islam or Islamic law or whatever it has. So I'm not dealing with that, but it is true that very much of the hadith on papyrus does not appear in the canonical collections. So the interesting thing is that actually it's an interesting question how the canonical collections have influenced the hadith that was produced in Egypt. Does it mean that those 6 canonical books were established? Does that mean, was that an idea of having an authority kind of in hadith? Well, of course, in a way it was. Like what is, so I'm actually asking this question as well. What was the political side of it all? The other thing is that some very prominent Egyptian hadith scholars are generally regarded as unreliable. So, for example, Abdullah ibn Lahi'a, who is maybe the most important hadith scholar in Egypt, and his name occurs frequently in papyri, is by traditional hadith biographers often regarded as unreliable. But I am asking myself, is that because he was far away from them? They were in Iraq, he was in Egypt. Is it because they could not check his material? Is it because they could not check reliability firsthand? So it is also the question, who are you? Like, where are you coming from if you question reliability? But me in my work, I'm not touching upon this topic because I'm not a hadith scholar, and I can, like, it would be difficult for me to tell because I don't have this background, how reliable these texts would be for Islamic religious or legal practice.
Thank you very much. Ahmad, would you like to ask your question? No? Okay. I'll come back to him if he wants to ask it in a second. All right. Another question coming in. When it comes to understanding the scope of where these have been documented, when you see a lot of these different papyrus, identified in different places, what proportion in general? I know it's very hard to know numbers, but what proportion in general are actually in books, and how many of them haven't yet been documented properly?
And papyri in general, or hadith that is in papyri?
Hadith papyri.
So I would say I could, from what I have looked at, I cannot tell you that I have seen all existing hadith papyri. This is impossible, because some collections are also very difficult to access, and we do not even know what holdings they have. So this is a very important remark to make. Many papyrus collections have very difficult access policies, and others have not even opened all their material, basically. So some collections still have unopened material from Egypt, and there could be anything in it, basically. So it's very difficult to tell how much I have seen and how much, how should I say that, how much of what is there I have seen. But from what I have seen, I could identify most hadith. Identify means I could find it somewhere else, in a book, like in a hadith collection, but most of them not in the 6 canonical books of hadith. But in other works, like in other works of hadith, which is actually not so surprising, because the 6 canonical books of hadith were introduced to Egypt basically sometime during the 4th Hijri century, which was when papyrus was not in use anymore. So it could be expected that the evidence on paper, so on later documents, would be quite different.
Thank you. Ahmed, you didn't ask a question?
Yeah. You know, at the beginning, you mentioned that there was you're talking about standardized version of the Sunni Quran. So what did you mean by that? Was there a version of the Shia Quran?
As far as I know, but I'm in no way specialized.
But you mentioned it in your talk.
After the Uthmanic Quran was sent out to basically all provinces, like there is this story, right? That the Quran of Uthman ibn Affan was sent out to all province capitals, and that all other versions that existed were burnt. There is this story, even if it's not, how should I say, historically accurate in every detail. It might or might not be, we have no way of telling. At least it means that some kind of authoritative version did exist, or should have existed at that time. But as far as I know, it still took a longer time for distinctly Shi'i material to develop, because also at that time we do not have this how should I say, we do not have this gap between a Sunni and a traditionally Shi'i transmission line. Like we do not have material that is Sunni and material that is Shi'i. So that happens a lot later, that they develop as different textual traditions. So that is something that definitely happens after that. That was basically what I meant, and it also concerns some passages of the Quran.
But there is an understanding among the Shi'is that Imam Ali had his own, he used to write whenever the Prophet used to receive revelation. So in a way he had a chronological form of the verses of the Quran.
Yes, but as far as I know, we do not have evidence for that at this early stage. I mean, we also don't have evidence for the Uthmanic Quran. That is of course true, but I'm not familiar with the precise Shi'i historiography on that version of the Quran. But so I can only speak about what I more or less know. So it was also during the first 3 centuries that the Uthmanic Quran. So there is still a lot of discussion about what we know nowadays as the Azhar or as the Uthmani Quran, and as the different with the different readings and all that. There was still work going on like especially on the different readings and vocalization of the Quran in the first 3 Islamic centuries, but it was mainly done after that. So that's actually the main point that I wanted to make.
Thank you. One question which has come from someone watching on YouTube. How do these papyrus compare in age with the Timbuktu manuscripts and other significant historical Islamic documents?
Those papyri are the
How does how do they compare in age with the Timbuktu manuscripts and other historical Islamic documents? Are these much earlier, or how do they fit with the
yes, basically they are. So Arabic papyri are the earliest surviving source for Islamic history, apart from coins, inscriptions, and some Quranic leaves that were C14 dated to the first Islamic century. C14 dating is also a difficult topic, but so the most ancient documents that we have from Islamic history whose age is confirmed are the very early Quran leaves from Saudi Arabia that are on parchment. And for example, there's a very famous of them in Birmingham, very famous document of those very early Quranic leaves. Coins, early Islamic inscriptions, because inscriptions are dated mostly, so we can verify that they are really from the very first years of the Islamic era. Coins, of course, are also dated. And we have Arabic papyri, because we know from the time frame where Arabic was written on papyrus that they must come from the time between the Islamic conquest of Egypt and the introduction of paper in Egypt. And the earliest document written on a movable source that are not coins is that document. The earliest dated document from Islamic history is that request for provision for the army that is kept in the Austrian National Library, which is dated to the year 22 of the Hijrah. And as since we are speaking about the beginning of the Islamic conquests, it is actually only also at that time that the African continent it starts to get Islamicized, basically, or that Islam is introduced to the African continent. If you do not count the first Hijrah, or if you speak about North Africa specifically. And so it means that papyri are the oldest textual source for elaborate texts that go beyond the inscriptions and coins that we have from Islamic history.
Thank you very much. That's exactly what he was looking for. Another question, in the papyrus collections that you talked about, you mentioned obviously in one of them about the story of Imam Hussein being in one of the, or potentially being in one of the papyrus ones. Obviously, you said you can't be sure. In general, is this because are these mainly from Egypt and therefore less likely to have a more Shi'i, leaning, or because of the Fatimid time, it's going to be more? Like, what do you see in terms of Shia Sunni split of the Hadith collections that you've seen in terms of where you find?
So that is actually a question I'm asking myself a lot, because I have found some texts that nowadays, and that is the important thing, nowadays, you would say these are, it reminds us of Shi'i points of view or Shi'i ideas yes. But we have to be very careful, because we're speaking about the first Islamic centuries. So I would not use the term Shi'i here, because we do not have a separate text tradition at this time that we can verify. There might have been, there might have been scholars who were very much in favor of this idea or of that idea, of this way of thinking or that way of thinking, but we have no way of verifying that. So I'm very careful of speaking about Sunni and Shi'i material. There is one papyrus that is actually going to be published in an article of mine on the 10th of December. So if you like, just a couple of days, just a couple of sleeps. Anyway, the papyrus that I've published there basically mentions, well, it has some kind of isnad at the beginning. It's fragmentary, unfortunately, but what is very clearly visible is that it mentions that Ali should have been the first caliph instead of Abu Bakr. This is the first point. The second point is, how is this argued? How is this, how does the text argue in favor of this idea? It argues by a passage from Surah Al-Imran about the people of Imran having been chosen, and that they are the descendants of Ibrahim and so on, and they have been chosen. They are the chosen people. And then there is a passage that appears in the tafsir of Furat al-Kufi, which is the earliest Shi'i tafsir that we can distinctly identify as Shi'i. So the interesting thing is why, so, but the text by Furat al-Kufi is younger than this papyrus. So, like from the dates when Furat al-Kufi lived, we know that he lived probably after this papyrus was written. So the important thing is this text on the papyrus is not from the tafsir tafsir of Furat al-Kufi, but it has gone into, it comes from a source that has also gone into the tafsir of Furat al-Kufi. What do we make out of this? We can, so I'm very reluctant of saying this scholar was Shi'i and he had this Shi'i point of view. I'm very reluctant to say that. But what we can definitely say is that this was part of scholarly discussion. This is the very basic, this is the basic statement that I can make out of this. It was part of the scholarly discussion. And there are also papyri actually that have du'as that are nowadays only found in Shi'i sources. What does it mean? It can just mean that for some reason Sunni tradition has discarded these things at some point because the Sunni scholars just didn't find them relevant, and at a later time the Shi'i scholars did find it relevant. So that's a thing. And also in this big text collection that I showed you, there is very much material that includes Fatima and her dialogues with the Prophet at the time of his death, that is nowadays only found in very marginal Sunni collections, actually collections of weak hadith, and in Shi'i sources. But it's very easy to imagine why Sunni tradition has discarded this, because it's just some dialogue material with Fatima. It was maybe just not regarded as to be as relevant, but for the Shi'i tradition it would be very relevant, of course. So I do not want to say that there was a distinct Shi'i identity present at the time that papyri were produced in Egypt, because I have zero evidence for that. But what I do have evidence for is that those ideas were part of the discussion. This is what I can say definitely.
Thank you very much. So there was someone who asked on the Zoom chat. I think it's the name is Zoom Benutzer, but would you like to ask directly? Just unmute yourself.
Yes, I will. Thank you, and thank you for this very, very good talk and insight. I was wondering why there is such a large collection of papyri in Vienna. Do you have an idea?
Yes,
and thank you.
It's pure coincidence, can be said in a couple of words. The coincidence is not that the collection is large, other collections are also huge, but the coincidence, the strange coincidence somehow, is that most of them are Arabic, because papyri exist in many, many languages. They start, of course, with the ancient Egyptian language, hieroglyphs, and the youngest that's written on papyrus, the youngest language is Arabic. So the coincidence that is remarkable is that so many of the Vienna collection, the biggest part is Arabic, and it's a pure coincidence. Those papyri were bought in the 19th century from Egypt via an Austrian trader who resided in Cairo. It was during the time of Orientalism, where Europeans were very much interested in so-called Oriental artifacts. And among those artifacts were also artifacts of scholarly interest. Not only collectors, but also scholars were part of this kind of fashion, and papyri were so not only pharaonic artifacts, but also papyri were being started to be discovered in the sand in Egypt, in a certain stratum of the soil. And so European scholars were interested in those texts because they were mainly scholars in Semitic languages and so on, so they were just interested in that. And local traders, like local farmers, actually excavated in, of course, nowadays something like that would be illegal. Yes, and excavated these things and sold them to local traders, who then sold them on to local European traders, who sold them to European scholars and institutions who were interested. And it also so happened that they were bought on behalf of an Austrian scholar, Josef von Karabacek, who had contacts to the Austrian imperial family, who basically sponsored the acquisition with their money. And it is a pure coincidence that of the documents that he bought, the majority turned out to be Arabic. And this is the collection that nowadays exists in the Austrian National Library.
Where are the other major collections?
So we consider, after the Austrian National Library, we consider the collection in Berlin to be the second biggest collection of Arabic papyri, though we do not have precise numbers from Berlin because they haven't finished stock taking, actually, but it is believed that once they give each document a shelf mark, an inventory number, that the number will increase to at least the number that the Vienna collection holds. The other very big collection is, of course, the Egyptian National Library in Cairo, but it is the same like with the Berlin collection, that stock taking is not over because just of the multitude of objects in general that they have, not only papyri. So it is probably less than what is preserved in Vienna, but we don't have exact numbers. And after Vienna and Berlin, there are some relevant collections in Germany, in the UK, in the United States as well. Well, in Egypt, the National Library. So in Russia, in many different places, but so like generally Vienna, Berlin, and Cairo are the cities, are the places with the biggest collection of Arabic papyri.
How much research is currently being done on papyri? Is it a major area of research within this area, or in general, or very, very few are like yourself and looking at this first sources?
There is very little research being done on Arabic papyri, so there is currently no full position, or not even a half position that is only dedicated to the research on Arabic papyri worldwide. So not at any institution. So all of us, so there is the International Society for Arabic Papyrology that gathers scholars who in some way work with Arabic documents, not only papyri, also later paper documents, and of course also the time that papyrus was used, people also used to write on other materials, so that is all included, of course. But there are comparably few scholars who are really active in this field, especially due to a lack of funding. We all basically, like our positions are all actually do have other main content or tasks that we are responsible for, and we all do papyri more or less on the side or as only as part of our time. So and also, so we are a bit marginal, as well as, like, on the one hand, among papyrologists, we are a small group because Greek papyrology is actually a huge group of people compared to us, Arabic papyrologists. And also in Arabic and Islamic studies, we are also only a small group. So even so, the group, for example, working on Islamic manuscripts is a lot bigger than us Arabic papyrologists. So yes, there's actually the community of like really like specifically Arabic papyrologists is quite small.
Thank you very much. I think we will end there. There have been a couple of other questions, but given our time, we've taken, I think, over an hour of your time after the Quran, and so thank you very much for speaking, for sharing your thoughts, and for participating today. And thank you for the audience, everyone who's come and joined us. Just a couple of quick announcements before we finish. Next week we have another talk on the US elections, what the results mean for Muslim communities, by Brenda Abdelal, and she is was part of Americans for Biden, and she was also one of the congressional candidates within one of the districts. The week after, we have Dr. Celine Ibrahim. She's going to be talking about her new book, Women and Gender in the Quran. And then we have a break over Christmas, and we'll have some more talks afterwards. So thank you all very much for joining. Hope you can join again next week. And thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for the invitation.